Okay, we'll start off. So we have 3 speakers now for the next maybe hour and 15 minutes. So I'm going to be chairing the panel. So we've invited a few speakers to come and talk. We've said that they could either give like a polished research-based presentation or throw out some kind of speculative ideas around decarbonizing research. So maybe talking points or just personal reflections from the field. So it's up to themselves the kind of direction they wanted to take it. So I'll briefly introduce, we'll take the speakers up one by one, and we'll give you a mic as well. I'll briefly introduce them and let them take it away from there. So our first speaker is Professor Patrick Lonergan. And I'm sorry, I actually have your bio and it's just right there, so I'm going to grab it. So yeah, Patrick is Professor of Drama and Theatre Studies at University of Galway and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. He specialises in Irish drama and theatre, theatre history, theatre archives, digital humanities and concepts of the Anthropocene. So Patrick, you can come up when you're ready and take it away.
Thanks, Mel.
No problem.
So hi everyone, it's great to be here and thanks very much for the invitation. The practice of making theatre is driven by a desire to take the imagination and express it physically in some way. And so I think, therefore, theatre offers a really interesting way to think about decarbonisation because it functions both in our imagination and in the material world as well. So it affects how we imagine carbon, but it also produces carbon because it uses lights and other things like that. So I think for me, when I was invited to talk about this, really what struck me is that thinking about decarbonising theatre studies involves moving very fluidly between that theory and practice thing, between the conceptual and the physical. But I also think that is one of the reasons that theatre studies is a particularly useful way into this topic. So, you know, a lot of the books I'm going to mention and the ideas I'm going to mention are, I'm sure, ideas that people have encountered before, books that people have already read. But what I would hope might be useful and maybe even distinctive is how they're applied in theatre studies or can be applied in theatre studies in ways that might be novel or useful. Okay, so one starting point, how many people know this book? As a quick show of hands, no? Yeah, Nessa does, yeah. There's a kind of a thing I've noticed in papers about climate change where you could almost have a bingo card. So you've got Andreas Malm, Amitav Ghosh and others. So get your bingo cards at the ready. This is a good one for it. When I think about decarbonising theatre studies, my starting point is often with this book, Andreas Malm's book, Fossil Capital. So fossil capitalism is the concept that cultural norms have developed in such a way as to render the link between capitalism and fossil fuel usage appear to be inevitable. You know, it's just the way things are, it's natural. And so what that means is then, because theatre is embedded in the fossil economy, theatre makers have fallen prey to the idea that their use of fossil fuels is similarly inevitable. It's not the outcome of a set of choices, it is the way things are. And this also means that stage plays often present the use of fossil fuels as normal, as inevitable. They do this through the stories that they tell, they do it through scenography, okay, so how stages are designed. And one very good example of that is that by far the most frequently used stage property in 20th century Irish drama, it's not a sacred heart, it's not a pint glass, it's not a loy or a farming implement, it's a sod of turf. hundreds of Abbey Theatre plays. And you can see this in the digital archive. The most frequently used prop is turf. And yet, if you were to ask people what they noticed on the stage, what they saw there, I mean, this is anecdotal, but I would suggest that for many of them, the turf is invisible. They're not even aware that it's there. So methodologically, I think that there's a need to align our theatre histories and these carbon histories, see where they overlap, see where they diverge, and see how they have influenced each other. Going back to Fossil Capital, in that book, Malm has a very memorable quote where he describes petrol burning cars as invisible missiles aimed at the future. And he makes that claim because he says that their greatest impact will be upon generations not yet born, which is provocative, but in a really good way. So if we accept the truth of that statement, and we must accept the truth of that statement, then I think it also becomes valid to question whether theatre might be a missile at the future as well, something lobbed, maybe unavoidably, maybe unintentionally, at future generations. So why would we say that? Well, we know that theatre makers burn fossil fuels. They've been doing it for hundreds of years when they used gas to light their theatres, when they use electricity to light their stages, when they take their shows on tour. Okay, go and see a stage production like Les Miserables, and its carbon footprint is greater than that of a university like this, for a start. Since the mid-20th century, though, there's also been a very strong link between professional theatre companies and energy companies, oil and gas companies in particular, petrol as well, through sponsorship and other forms of indirect support. So if you want to look at the history of Ibsen in Norway in the 20th century, you have to think about the history of Norwegian oil and how they've sponsored Ibsen. If you want to think about Shakespeare in Britain, you have to think about BP and how they supported the Royal Shakespeare Company up to very recently. A campaign called BP or Not BP led to the relationship falling apart, for the better, I think. But even here in Ireland, again, go into the Abbey archive, there's really interesting stuff there about how the Abbey was acting as a cheerleader for the Irish investment in peat burning electricity plants being constructed as well. So that relationship is definitely there. I suppose I'd also say, I think the idea of fossil capital applies to playwriting. I often think of the example of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. And in that play, he has Titania, the fairy queen, describe how her arguments with Oberon have had climate-altering impacts. With thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport, she says. Therefore the winds piping to us in vain, as in revenge, have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs, which, falling on the land, have every pelting river made so proud that they have overborne their continents. And through this distemperature, we see the seasons alter. Great piece of writing. I love the way when she's talking about the river breaking across its banks. You'll also notice that the verse line breaks across the punctuation there too. Fantastic example of form and content coming together in Shakespeare. So look, he might have been writing about fairies here, but what he's also showing us is that agency, individual agency, can have planetary repercussion. Okay, our argument has caused the rivers to break their banks. That's what she's saying. So maybe that's another kind of missile to the future. Maybe it's another depth charge that is exploding with relevance in the present. A second methodological approach, I think, though, is to consider our notions of the real and the fantastical. And if you have your bingo card, you're probably expecting this one, Amitav Ghosh. So we know that theatre has shaped attitudes towards the real. Decarbonizing theatre therefore requires us to decarbonize our sense of realism and of reality. And that's what Ghosh is writing about in relation to fiction. So in The Great Derangement, his argument is, and I'm going to simplify it really, that when an author tries to write about weather today and tries to do that realistically, the results seem like science fiction or fantasy, because our conception of realism is too limited to capture the reality of the change in our climate, the change in the weather. And he says it is as though in the literary imagination, climate change were akin to extraterrestrials or interplanetary travel. So, obvious things you can take from this. If our realism isn't broad enough to capture the reality that we now face, then we need to do something with realism. And so in theatre, practice-based approaches to playwriting or directing or stage work can allow us to think about that. But the second thing is that it is possible that literature, film, drama, other forms of representational art are actually inhibiting our understanding of the ecological, and therefore perhaps inhibiting people's sense of power and their ability to change. If you think that climate change is akin to extraterrestrials or interplanetary travel, well, then it seems like something that you can't affect. You can't change it yourself. And so it's very interesting that of all the plays that have been written about climate change, most of them are science fiction or fantasy or, dystopic in some way. But in all cases, they draw attention to their artificiality. So you can see here in the image on the right, okay, that's a polar bear, but the audience watching that can see very clearly that it's also a human behind the polar bear, literally pulling the strings. And the whole point of the representation is to say, this isn't real. This is us pretending. This is us making this for you. And I think that's important. The next thing I wanted to talk about, it relates to this, is the concept of the Anthropocene Unconscious. And it's to do with this idea that if theatre has suppressed knowledge, if theatre has caused us to forget or ignore, well, how can we track that? Again, interesting theories about this. Jean-Baptiste Frézeau has a book called Lapocalypse Joyful, in which he says that basically we have been ignoring our capacity for planetary destruction since the 1700s. And he's saying that, this idea that we came up with the Anthropocene in the early 2000s is kind of ridiculous, because we've known we were doing this for a very long time. So how and why did we forget? A similar example, I think, is Donna Haraway's book, where she talks about the fact that since 1990, we shouldn't be using the word the Anthropocene to talk about that period. We should refer to it as the Dithering. And she makes that argument on the basis that, the first IPCC report said very clearly this is happening, and we dithered. And so theatre has perhaps allowed us to dither, like Hamlet, doing nothing, right? And so maybe that's something we need to think about as well. Okay, so what do we do with that? How do we track down these forgotten or neglected forms of knowledge? A good example of this book came out last year, and it's Mark Bowles' book, The Anthropocene Unconscious. And what he's essentially saying is, as it says on the screen there, that anthropogenic climate destabilization manifests in texts that are not overtly about climate change. So in other words, it happens unconsciously. So what he's trying to do is to find a method, to find evidence of these things happening in ways that show human agency, but not necessarily conscious human agency. And it's a really interesting way of coming at it. And I would argue that line from Midsummer Night's Dream is a good example of the Anthropocene Unconscious. Like, Shakespeare wasn't saying there's too much carbon in the atmosphere, but he was saying there's something strange happening with the relationship between the human and the climate. Last thing I wanted to say then is, I think where all this leads is to the, realization that theatre is a material art form. It uses stuff, it uses things. And that's where the concept of future fossils, and again, your bingo card will have that on it, I'm sure, is very, very important. So the concept of future fossils relates to the idea that everything that we use will have repercussions well into the future. So, you go to the cinema and you have your popcorn and your Coke or whatever, and it's a 15-minute thing, and you think that's the end of my use of this product. But actually that stuff will still be around long after you're dead. Okay, so it's a future fossil. So when we think about future fossils, very well articulated in the book by David Farrier, I think, actually, if you're interested in reading a scholarly approach to it, we can think about that in relation to theatre's use of building materials like sets and costumes. We can think about producing show programs All of those things are relevant. But I think future fossils is also an interesting way to think about ideas, to think about our actions as well, but they will have consequences long after our lifetimes, and we won't be able to predict those consequences, but we're still responsible for them. And that involves new ways of thinking. I think also related to that then is, this again is about the Anthropocene Unconscious, it's about showing how people in the past have made things manifest. So I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but it's from a revival of Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, from 2016. And what it makes really clear is, through the use of stage design, is how Shakespeare, at the end of his career, was really thinking about how human imagination conceives of the natural as something to be subdued, but the natural world always fights back or has its own say in the matter. And so what the staging in the play is doing is it's kind of pulling this out and saying, we need to look at this thing that was in Shakespeare's original from this meaningful perspective in the present. So this is perhaps a fossil that has come into our future, our present, Shakespeare's future, I should say. But what are the ways that we're producing things for the future ourselves? Deepak Chakrabarty writes about this really interestingly when he says that as humans, we are now living in two kinds of now time. So you've got the now time of human history that we all live in, but there's also the longer now of geological processes and biological processes. And so what we have to be able to do is to live in those two forms of now time simultaneously. So where I would conclude with this, with theatre studies, is just to think about that. What does it mean to be in these two kinds of now time simultaneously? What are the impacts for that in terms of how we think and theorize and conceptualize? But what are the impacts also for how we make things in space with other people? There we go. Thanks very much, everyone. Yeah.
Thanks a million. Thank you so much, Patrick. That was wonderful. So our second speaker is Dr. Siobhan Gahan. So Siobhan is Program Manager at the Molecular Parasitology Laboratory at University of Galway. She is a Migraine Labs ambassador with extensive expertise in industry and research. Take it away, Siobhan. Yep.
Did you say you do?
Yep.
Yeah.
Should be here.
Okay, so hi everyone. So my talk is about decarbonizing research, but from a green laboratory perspective. And let's see, page down. Should be here. Page down, but this one, great, lovely. So I'd like to thank Leisha and Ashley for inviting me to speak at this workshop. This is a little bit of my background, sorry. So I graduated here from microbiology from UCG, as it was called at the time, and then I've worked in different laboratories in Scotland and Ireland. And then I graduated with a PhD from Royal College of Surgeons here in Ireland, and now I am working in the Molecular Parasitology Laboratory with Professor John Dalton and his team. So why should we decarbonize research? So, sorry, there's just a little thing here. Could we get rid of that, if you don't mind, the little box? Thanks, Amelia. So, laboratories are resource-intensive spaces. They produce 5 to 10 times more energy than office spaces. They use 5 times more water, and they produce 5.5 million metric tons of plastic waste worldwide annually. So plastics are the initial thing you will see in a laboratory, the single-use plastics. That's the most obvious thing that we see on a day-to-day basis. But the environment is also impacted by the amount of energy we consume from freezers and high energy use equipment, and all the water we use in different processes, and how we use lab chemicals and what we do with them once the experiment is finished. So I'd like to introduce the Migraine Lab organization. So that's a non-profit organization from the US, and we first heard about it from Professor Una Fitzgerald in Curram. So Migraine Lab runs a lab certification program. So it's an online assessment program. There are 14 topics covered. The team in the lab would answer 175 questions, takes about 30 to 45 minutes to complete, and the focus is on lab behaviours and actions of lab members can take to become greener. It takes about 8 to 10 months to complete the certification journey. So initially, a lab would assess the baseline, and we have a survey to do that, and then the organisation then will give us different recommendations from what we can do from our day-to-day practices in order to change things for the better. And then we do another survey, and then at that stage you're either certified or you have to go back and change things again. And then after certification is not finished, it's just that would take 8 to 10 months, and then you make more changes over a 2-year period, and then we would complete a recertification again. So the first lab that was certified here in University of Galway was the Curram lab up at the Biomedical Sciences building. So it was Professor Una Fitzgerald who brought this concept to the university. She is a lecturer in neuroscientist here at NUI Galway, and Curram was the first lab in Europe to be certified, and that happened in 2019. And Una is the spearhead of all the Green Lab initiatives here within the college, and without her it wouldn't have happened, so thanks Una. She's inspired us all. Our own lab then decided, we went to take the certification. This was our baseline score, so 46%, wasn't too bad, but we had improvements to make, so our team made improvements. So some of the things that we've done was we up-chilled our -80 freezers to -70 degrees centigrade, thus saving 72.5 kilowatts of energy per day. So just as for you to understand what that might mean, like a normal fridge that you might have, or a 24 cubic foot fridge, uses 54 kilowatts per month. So every day we're saving 72.5 kilowatts of energy by just changing that temperature from -80 up to -70. Now we have 6 freezers, so. And then other things to do with freezers, like filter cleaning, inventory, establishing inventories. And then the simplest thing and the easiest thing that we have done is we switch off all equipment that is not in use. So it's quite a simple thing to do, we just turn it off. Then autoclaves, dishwashers, we run them full, and we have things in labs called fume cupboards. They use up the same energy as 4 domestic houses. So in order to reduce the energy taken from them, we shut them off if we can, but we close the sash, which is a simple thing to do, and it reduces the energy taken up by these instruments. The buildings department have installed LED lights, and we try to reduce water consumption, and on our fieldwork we try to leave no trace when we are out on the farms. Also manage chemical inventories and consolidate ordering as best we can do, bearing in mind that all our labs are working separately in the university, so that's one point we've been talking about during the discussions, consolidating ordering. We share surplus reagents and equipment with other labs. We try to follow green chemistry practices and purchase chemicals that have reduced toxicity to use within our experiments. And we try to reduce the amount of reagents, plastics and distilled water used in experiments, and also we carpool to transport ourselves to the farms to do our work. We carried out a waste audit, so we had great fun trawling through the bins, but there's a picture here of what we've done. And we managed to divert 5 kilograms of plastic waste from the general and hazardous waste streams to the recyclable waste stream. And these bags of tip boxes you see down on the trolley, they are sent to be made into fence posts in County Clare. So then after, we got 94%, which was like, yay, aren't we great? You know, but this was a whole team effort, and everybody was really on board and are really keen to work towards green sustainability. However, we've still a lot more work to do. So that's the certification. So now we're on our 2-year journey. So after 2 years, we will, you know, make more improvements. This here is our molecular parasitology green team who worked on the certification. And this gives you an overview of all of the green labs that have been certified within University of Galway so far, and some of, you know, there are more on board to gain certification. So, and we also have Caroline's lab there. Caroline, can wave to everyone. She's from microbial ecology, and she got that quite recently, didn't you? Yeah. So there are more labs also encouraged to get Green Lab certification, and these are the people who are involved in leadership in Green Lab certification throughout the college. Okay, so in Ireland then, there are 115 labs across Ireland also engaged with the Migraine Lab certification programme. So they're a range of different labs, from university, hospital, state labs, environmental labs, and veterinary labs, and corporate labs. Again, here we see Professor Una Fitzgerald and her team. So they have been funded for a project to demonstrate as a proof of concept whether a single-use plastic that we're throwing out all the time can be recycled into another useful polypropylene lab product. So they're working with the Technological University in Shannon and Applied Polymer Technologies and NVTech as well, to create a new product that can be used from old waste product to try and have a circular economy within this university for that particular product. So Una is also key in helping to set up the Irish Green Labs Network, which is a network to encourage sustainability within labs, so corporate labs, hospital labs, and different labs throughout Ireland. So that's a great resource for anyone who needs more information. Please feel free to follow us on Twitter. And this was launched publicly on Green Earth Day this year. And the aim is to minimize the negative impact that Irish laboratory work has on the environment. Okay, so what next? So I challenged our team within the Molecular Parasitology Lab this week to come up with some ideas, you know. So I'll just read through them. Sorry, now this will be me reading text, but anyway, they would like every lab on campus to be green certified, and fully support and resourced sustainability department, which is one of the topics we were discussing earlier. So that this department would enable staff sustainability training, organise recycling, implement centralised lab supply shop, because each individual lab is ordering separately. If we had one centralised solution, then you wouldn't have all the DPD trucks and the DHL trucks coming and going, one to me, one to Caroline, one to, you know, the person up in Curram. And to help with recycling old chemicals and reusing old equipment. So one lab might be finished with a piece of equipment, but another lab could desperately need it within the university. And then outside the university, maybe to facilitate giving old chemicals and equipment to labs that in the third world that may need this type of resource. So to support and introduce waste packaging take-back schemes, and to have storage areas to enable this to function. and also to support hazardous waste chemical recycling on site if at all possible. In the histology labs, we use a lot of ethanol that could be recycled through a distillation process instead of us having to buy and get shipped in and send off and send our waste to be incinerated. Okay, and then again, the University and Procurement Office has a central role in helping us achieve all these goals. Suppliers and scientists do need to be truthful about our green credentials and stop greenwashing. Funding agencies need to calculate the true carbon footprint of funding proposals and fund accordingly, fund the green projects. Organise more green events and conferences, look at travel to conferences, use slow travel options. Could you get the ferry, the train to London, the Eurostar to Paris? Can you do that? Encourage maybe organise your conference so you're not hopping from one continent to another, just amalgamate them all into one space and time if you could. Support work from home, travel to work schemes, and more park and ride options for Galway, please. Smart building design and control for heating, lighting, energy consumption and use of space. One good idea was that within our building, the Orbson building, it has sliding doors. It's just letting the heat out. Why not have circular doors? So that's came from our head of lab idea. So it's a good idea. Okay, so I'm going to challenge you all to think, what can you do to make a difference in your research? And this is our molecular parasitology team, who were absolutely wonderful at the Galway Science Festival. I'll just name them out. So it's Jesus, Isti, Nicola, Amanda, Richard, Eve, and Carolina. So thank you.
Thanks a million, Siobhan.
Okay,
Lovely. So our third speaker is Dr. Nessa Cronin. Nessa is lecturer in Irish Studies and Associate Director of the Moore Institute at University of Galway. Her work focuses on space and faith in Irish writing and culture, the environmental humanities, cultural geography, colonial and post-colonial geographies, and women in Irish natural history. Thanks, Ashley. I was actually just looking. Yeah, you got it.
One, two, one, two. Ah, there we go.
All good?
Yep.
Okay, great. Just ar dús bhfuilm míle buchas a bhuairt ar Ashley agus Líseach chun an cardlan seo reachtáil inniuh agus just tá sé th bar ar fád agus chun tosnú mada leis an ceise mada le ceisna taide agus an nascatá ann idir an taire roide agus gacin rudatá le déanamh going san ollscoil Ingáileh agus an éireann agus an áitna idirnáisiúnta freisin agus tá sé go hálinn freisin ghfuil daoine an th Zoom, so fáilte teach go dtí an seomra Zoom as well. I just want to say thanks so much to Ashley and Líseach for organising this. We had lots of conversations about it over the last few months, and it's just really interesting to see people from different parts of campus coming on from different perspectives. Often we're stuck in our own silos in the arts and humanities, or the science people on the science end, and we don't often get the opportunity to listen and to learn. So I think hopefully this will be the start of many more conversations in this area on campus in the future and in the Zoom room as well. Today I'm just going to look at the idea of decarbonising research, and I suppose I am coming from an arts and humanities and social sciences perspective, and I'm going to talk about these photos in a moment. So my own background is actually in philosophy and literature, and I took a diversion towards cultural geography for my PhD, and over the last 10 years a lot of my work has been looking at the idea of place and people and planet. And I've worked a lot with artists and communities, looking at how communities in Ireland and internationally are dealing with all of these kinds of questions, but using the arts and humanities as a lens through which to capture the problems and challenges communities have, but also to work as researchers as well. So it's not just the scientists that are answering these questions about, you know, the big challenge of our generation. So this is just one artist, Fiona Woods. And this was a project that she had as part of the Tulka Visual Arts Festival in Galway in 2010. And she was looking at the idea of interspecies interdependency, and this idea of, you know, we often think of ourselves as human, but separate from the animal world. So she kind of had all of these posters around town in different places, and they were very arresting images that make people like stop and have a look again when they're in the bus stop, when they're outside McDonald's, when they're walking down Shop Street with a pint in their hand, just making them rethink, I suppose, their own positionality on the planet in different ways. And with that, the idea of kind of speculative imaginaries has emerged as a way of thinking through, kind of following on up what Patrick was saying, in terms of maybe legacies that we've inherited were fit for a 19th century world and not really maybe fit for purpose anymore in the 21st century. So no more than labs of old did things in a certain way, we now need to do things a lot differently as well. So we've a lot to learn from each other in that area in particular. So often we're the baby in the room. So it's the big boys, literally the big white male scientists, usually from the global north, are in the main room in COP and in intergovernmental panels of climate change, talking to usually big white boys in suits, the government leaders, about what's going to happen to our future. So before the COP26 discussions in Glasgow last year, a few of us decided, we already knew that the arts and humanities were going to be left out of the discussions more or less, other than random token kind of gestures. So we had a post-COP26 discussion that was chaired with Future Earth Ireland and the Royal Irish Academy, and co-hosted with the Moore Institute. And it was looking at climate change in the arts and the role of the arts and humanities and the challenges that are there, but also what we can contribute to and are already contributing to massively in terms of rethinking societal change and the great transformation that will have to happen. And as a result of that, we had, I think, 220 people present at the webinar, over 14 countries. We had 12 panelists. But to capture what was discussed over what was a 2-hour webinar, we decided to do a blog post with the Irish Humanities Alliance as well. And that's worked really well in getting the news and the information out there. So it's a format that worked really well for us, and it's one I'd recommend for people organising webinars, to have something else that you can add on to it to distribute the ideas, because not everyone's going to sit down on a Friday night and watch a 2-hour webinar about the end of the world. So I have about 3 or 4 main ideas to talk about, and then I have like random thoughts at the end and kind of takeaways. So this is all, I thought I was going to have 3 slides, and then I kind of fell into a rabbit hole. So I'm going to zip through them all, and I'm happy to share the slides afterwards as well too. So decarbonising research is of course connected to the idea of sustainable development. Probably all of you in the room already know what that is. But we also need to think about where we are with it right now. And I was really shaken actually when I saw this video 3 days ago that was posted by the president of Tuvalu, which is a very low-lying coastal island in the Pacific. And where we are with the climate crisis really depends on where you physically are right now. So some places haven't really felt the brunt of it. In Ireland, maybe since 2015, we've been beginning to feel it a bit more with coastal surges, winter storms, droughts, etc. And even now, I think since last year, RTE have put in climate training in for all their journalists. So we're hearing an awful lot more about this discourse on RTE nearly every day of the week now that we didn't have even a year ago. This video clip here, again, very disturbing. You might remember the president from last year. He stood in the ocean and he gave his speech to COP26 in the ocean. This year he spoke from the metaverse, and he said we're already working with the metaverse to create Tuvalu digitally because it's not going to exist for very long. So they're already creating a digital nation. It's going to be the first digital nation created in the world. So they've already passed the tipping point. They're already beyond into a different carbon future. We're maybe not there yet, but it might not be that much longer. That's the cheery part. So sustainability then tends to be very STEM centered. So a lot of people do an awful lot of really great work, but maybe in the arts and humanities, social sciences, we're doing it in different ways, but often maybe not as part of the conversation, even in terms of sustainability strategies in universities. There's very few of us actually on those committees as well too. So just a couple of kind of 3 suggestions and pointers and points, and this again, from my own work with Future Earth Ireland, we've seen this, and Patrick's on that committee as well. We've seen it in terms of how different universities in Ireland internationally have different levels of engagement and action on this. So the first is integrating sustainability into research and teaching programs. That's not just tagging the SDG, like, you know, fancy label and tag onto it and kind of, I've ticked that box, but it's actually genuinely putting it in and thinking about it in a way in terms of environmental consciousness. At different levels that's appropriate for different stages of progression of student learning. The second one is something that I'm particularly interested in and active on, is integrating culture as the 4th pillar of sustainability. Very often people think of sustainability in terms of 3 key pillars. They're often taught there's just 3 key pillars: the social, the environmental, and the economic. But culture, since 2012, and the different ratifications of this, has been shown to have to be a vital infrastructure. That culture is the thing that makes it stick, or it won't. And there's been lots of discussion and work written on that as well. And one of the issues here is that social, environmental, and economic pillars of sustainability, particularly for organizations and for companies internationally, they translate that into people, planet, and profit. So you can immediately see how this translates into something equally problematic. So there's a lot of issues around the sustainability narratives as well too. And the third is like core principles. What can we think of from the arts and humanities and social sciences? And I know Laoisha and Ashley opened up with this today. I mean, for many of us working in this area, a core principle is that of equity and diversity and inclusion, and particularly for people working in the Global South and scholars and researchers, but also bringing in other kinds of non-Western discourse and other ways of thinking about how we're living on the planet, how we're thinking about it, and where we want to go in the future. And a lot of that tends to work in a collaborative and collective research projects rather than the lone wolf researcher. And with that, a lot of this is moving in a direction what we call feminist decolonizing practices. So it's a lot about, you know, feminist ways of doing things differently, and also decolonizing our ways of thinking and decolonizing the curriculum and research agendas with that. Yesterday, I had my first year English babies in with me in their Christmas jumpers. I congratulate them for even coming in and then still having to suffer me for 45 minutes or 50 minutes. But we were working through this article, Learning to Think Like a Planet, and reading it alongside Greta Thunberg. And so looking at it from a young climate activist perspective, but how we need to radically rethink things in a different way. So they were doing feminist decolonizing practices, but I haven't told them that yet. So that'll be the big reveal next week. So I just put this up here. Again, we can share this later. I won't go into too much detail. So I'm not the only one saying this about culture having to be the 4th pillar of sustainable development. And MacLeod and others have written about how culture is civilization's shared way of making sense of the world, what is real, what is knowable, and what has value. And I think it's that term of value is really important. Is like, what are we valuing and how is it valued? And like somebody said earlier, you know, a budget is a moral document. There are values attached to all of these things that we need to deeply question as well too. So some work that has been going on in Ireland and Galway is touching on some of this. So Rianach Ní Nail and Jolie had a project called Drowned Galway, and it was a socially engaged project looking at what Galway might look like under storm surges, tsunamis that emerge during moments of difficulty in the future. And it made people think, can you walk on water? Can you think of yourself in Galway underwater? And in a way, what they're doing is using culture and activating cultural forms of cultural expression as a means to imagine planetary futures, but also our present as well too. And this goes back to what Patrick was saying about future thinking and, you know, apocalyptic design, etc., but a lot of it has to come back to where we are right now. There's no point thinking about it in the future if we don't even get there. So practical stuff. So for conferences, so that's kind of the kind of the research kind of ideas. So in terms of policy, thinking about e-conferences or thinking about how to run hybrid conferences, and this is a wonderful example of how to do that. It's often about matching the meeting with the need. And this is just a document, again, we talked about this morning, that there's a lot of work out there, but maybe hasn't been discussed as much as possible. It's the ALEA report, which is an EU-wide consortium that was published in May 2022 this year, towards climate sustainability of the academic system. It's really the how-to and where-to guide about how to manage academia and institutes of higher education in the future. It's 90-odd pages, but it's well worth looking down and going through it. We contributed to it from Future Earth Ireland and the Royal Irish Academy. Diarmaid Tormey, our colleague on that committee, was the lead person for that. And our suggestion, or my suggestion to them, was this needs to be rolled out in each university and institute of technology or technological university now in Ireland, with trainings and workshops on it, because it's all there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So one example here of the meeting formats are, you know, online, hybrid, hub-based, in-person with optimized meeting location or in person. And then it gives the different aspects of it. Climate sustainability online is highest. Climate sustainability for in-person is lowest, for example. Networking opportunities, anecdotally reported as lower for online, but depends on implementation. For networking opportunities is best with in-person and in-person here. So, and again, that can be altered and catered in terms of what Ashley and Lishuk were talking about in terms of career progression and career stage. Early career researchers probably need to do more of this a little bit in the early stages, and those of us further along the food chain can maybe do more of this as well, and give space and opportunity for others to do the networking, to do the developing of the new ideas for the next generation. So it's a really useful document, and I'd recommend everybody to have a look at that as well. Other best practices, the University of Maastricht, we just talked about, you know, traveling and all of that. They have a fantastic dashboard on their website for staff to think about when they have to go to a meeting. What do you need to do? A checklist. I have to travel for the University of Maastricht. Is it really necessary? No. Then meet online. Yes. Is the journey less than 8 hours away? Yes. Take the train. Maybe not if you live in Connemara. No, take the plane, and then a greening contribution. So it's making you stop and think of the pathways of your journey as a researcher. Okay. And they have different aspects of it there, asking you questions to making you stop and think about it as well. Leeds University also has a great website with other just different kinds of resources for staff to think about and develop ideas. And this is a fantastic book. We talked about open access publishing. Again, this link is available. Everyone can go into it. Really great chapters on, there's a whole chapter on e-conferencing, which is really, really interesting. Just very generally, just some topics and themes that came out after I kind of very briefly perused the book for this conference today, was about ideas of research and teaching, and thinking through problem-based pedagogy. So bringing the research into the classroom and getting students engaged. So thinking about the theories of climate change in practice, like you were talking about, Patrick, as well, in terms of theatre, and using field work, and group presentations. So getting the students part and involved in the research project in different ways. So changing our assessment, changing the way we teach, and changing the different platforms on which we teach as well too. We need to also think about moving beyond information as to how knowledge is formed, created and shared, and also maybe more engagement as arts and humanities scholars with action-based research and teaching as well too. I suppose from the humanities side and from a critical humanities side, it often means about decolonizing research a little bit more and rethinking terms such as nature, culture, sustainability, resilience, adaptation, carbon footprints, and the environment. I mean, one example of the carbon footprint issue was how it was devised and designed with BP in 2004 as a carbon footprint calculator. And what it did was, while it's useful, it put away the responsibility of the generation of carbon, of what the carbon emissions were from institutions and corporations down into the individual. So it's kind of a nice new liberal little flip. that makes you feel guilty about what you're doing, even though there's bigger structural changes needed as well. We also need to think about rethinking access to research, who does it, how it's done, and how it's communicated. And we've talked a lot about that this morning already. And particularly when working with more inclusive research practices and thinking about the abilities of people to engage in research with different carbon contexts as well too. And it also means a wider integration of environmental and sustainability issues rooted in AHSS and STEM communities and disciplines, so that it's not just in one place, it's not just in one office, it's not just in one discipline and department, and that it is integrated across different levels of teaching and research as well. And finally, have here, it also means we need to train and upskill, not just in all of these things, but in questions of cultural diversity and reflexivity in navigating and negotiating the real complexity of societal issues that are already present and are coming down the tracks very, very quickly. Arts and humanities scholars are really well positioned, and social scientists are really positioned to contribute to those discussions on how research projects and programs are going to evolve with all of the challenges that are going to be there in the future as well. Okay, so a lot of this is kind of rethinking our research DNA, and Vincent talked about that this morning. He said, you know, we might get left behind as researchers because we're kind of head down, stuck in our own little world, and maybe not thinking about things about too much in terms of how what's going on outside. We might be doing that in our homes and private lives, but maybe it's really harder to do that when we move into the office. And just even the change of our patterns from home to office this morning, that was really interesting to see that. So it is about a big reconfiguration of people, place and planet, and it will need new, I don't normally quote myself, but I couldn't find anybody else to say what I wanted to say. But it will demand a new kind of thinking and action and challenge to received ways of being so that a post-carbon world can be created. So this is, and I suppose the big thing is that it's the dance macabre of two dancing partners where the urgency of the planet has to keep in step with the needs of particular peoples and places and vice versa. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's going to be very different in Bangladesh as it is in Belfast, and it's going to be very different in the global south and the global north. So final points. Part of this way, how are we going to change the way we're thinking and doing things? And one way of thinking about doing it is integrating something that people do in the sciences a little bit more and in the business end of college, which is design thinking. And I think this is something we could do more in arts and humanities, integrating how to challenge ourselves to think about a problem differently and have a more open envelope in terms of what gets talked about and what gets researched in different ways. So we're developing this in the university here in Galway, and I think it's something that can be very much broadened out to wider fields of expertise as well. So we're on the takeaway slide. So I think you have takeaways, and then I was like, not very sustainable, we'll go from farm to fork. So again, the core principles: equity, diversity, inclusion, thinking of feminist decolonial practices, but we always have to think of the risks as well. Who's getting left behind? What research areas are getting forgotten about? Why? And how can they be addressed? And just I did a quick kind of checklist for myself in terms of what I think are really important, and they might be obviously added to as well. Just to remind ourselves that research is a social activity and enterprise. And Bruno Latour, of course, the French philosopher who died recently, reminded scientists that they're not on their own, it's a social enterprise. And funders need to give sustainability training and incorporate sustainability as a core pillar to any research program. Just as the IRC did with gender considerations and gender bias, sustainability needs to be built into every funding application at every stage, at every level, across every discipline, nationally. End of. Culture has to be seen as the fourth pillar of sustainability, incorporated into all programs, and sustainability incorporated, obviously, into wider programs of research and teaching as well. I really think that design thinking, there's great potential there for that to help us make that transformational shift and thinking through these things, and more interdisciplinary conversations and training workshops such as this. So they're just my random thoughts this morning. I just want to say thank you so much and look forward to the discussion after. Okay.
Thanks a million, Nessa. So I might invite our three speakers up, and if you want to sit here, and we have about 20 minutes for questions and comments, if people have any. I'll just remove this as well. So I know, Lishuk, you might want to keep an eye on the online chat as well. Nessa, thanks a million. That was a really good mix of conceptual and practical ideas of and knowledge. So you have a question, yeah?
I would like to thank all the three speakers. Very nice presentations, very engaging. My question is specific to Patrick's presentation. Thank you for informing us that theatre studies are so much taking into account the climate change aspect now, and they have been taking into account all the natural resource management schemes that have been taking place since the 90s. I just wanted to understand that, do you think that the theatre plays and everything that take into account climate change and natural resource management and all these disasters that have the focal point for these topics, what kind of public and audience support and feedback do they have as compared to the theatre studies that have taken into account as focal point topics such as abuse and gender equality and all those social hot topics that people have been facing for a long time?
It's a really interesting question, thank you. So theatre has been addressing the climate crisis, I guess, directly since the 1990s, as you said. And I think it's doing that in two ways, where it's doing it on the conceptual level of thinking about how theatre has done this in the past and what it means, but it's also trying to inspire agency as well. Many of the plays that are about the climate crisis, I think, are very earnest and very well-meaning, but I think they can fall victim to the thing of essentially confirming what the audience already thinks, and therefore of not necessarily changing minds. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying it's somewhat limited. But where it's been particularly effective is when people have used theatre alongside other forms of activism to inspire change. So at a recent conference of the International Federation for Theatre Research, we heard some great examples of how people are using theatre to address issues related to water security in India and in the Philippines, how it's being used to address issues related to biodiversity in Brazil, how it's being used to address refugee rights in Sweden, and how it's doing a variety of different things. And I think that when theatre actually works with people, allows them to speak for themselves to others who probably don't actually know what has been going on, it's been hugely effective. So I think, as with a lot of these things, it's about thinking about the audience, and it's thinking about the change that you want to actually see happen as a result of your art.
Thanks, Patrick.
Hi, thanks to all of you for these amazing presentations. My question is for Siobhan specifically. I was talking to you like before, and I was wondering if you could mention a few words about the Green Lab for dry labs, if you would know, because it's more for chemistry and everything, but now data centers and data is becoming like the next big thing, and it takes lots of resources. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about that, if there is any initiatives there.
So, so far the labs that have been green certified are wet labs, as they call them, and there hasn't been a provision yet for certifying dry labs, which would be labs with computer equipment. So the Una Fitzgerald and Migraine Lab are working on a module so that we can roll it out here in the university to assess dry labs and go through a certification process, the same as we do for the wet labs, although it takes like initially, and then however much time it takes to make the improvements, then get the certification after another survey. So that's being developed right now. So it's not there yet, but it shouldn't be too hard to develop. I'll let you know as soon as email me.
Thanks, Siobhan. Oh yeah.
Just for myself, what is a wet lab and a dry lab?
So a wet lab is one where we have water and media and bacteria and flasks of stuff, samples from the environment. A dry lab would be like your physics labs. electronics.
Okay.
theatres.
Okay, that's really interesting. I just had this flashback from whenever COVID, it was like wet pubs and dry pubs. And I was like, wait, what? No, those were like 3 really amazing presentations. I just wanted to acknowledge something else that we didn't say is Una Fitzgerald actually was going to give a presentation here as well, but she said because she's in the Czech Republic right now, she didn't think in the spirit of the event that she should fly back here to do that and go back to the Czech Republic after that. So I just wanted to say that, you know, she was going to be here, but she decided rightly that, you know, in the spirit of what we're doing, it wouldn't be right to fly back and forth multiple times. So just to put that on the record, I'll give it back.
Thanks a million. Nessa.
Yeah, can I just ask Siobhan a question actually? No problem. It's great to have a scientist in the room. We had a wonderful workshop yesterday on digital humanities, and a question came up as part of that discussion about the environmental impact of data centres, and a lot of people working in arts and humanities are moving in that direction or have done so for many years. So is there any template for that from the dry lab kind of
Not that I
scenario
know
we
of
could
right
maybe...
now, but you know, it's something that could be developed, definitely.
It's a whole area that's been
Yeah.
developed now, and it could be really, like, no point also being
No.
able to reveal again.
No, not that I'm aware of right
Yeah.
now, but I know even from our own labs we have to store our data as well, our raw data from our machines and things, so that it will be available in the future for the university and for other researchers in an open science platform. So we are also have to think about that. That will be our next thing in our 2-year recertification process. We'll have to take that into account. So things are moving. we have to improve our practices.
To follow on, can I just ask, why haven't the dry labs been certified yet? Is that just it hasn't happened yet, or is there something particular about the? It just hasn't happened.
Probably don't know about it.
Just need to turn off the switch.
Yeah, but no, I mean, like Nessa saying, you know, that these large data projects, they certainly generate, you know, heat and all the rest of it. So yeah.
Yeah, things are moving.
Yeah.
Thanks. I actually have a response to Patrick's presentation, and you can respond to it if you want, or we could just kind of leave it for the room. But I thought, yeah, I was interested in your thinking on theatre as a missile to the future, and you're thinking about how, you know, theatre might kind of affect or influence our thinking about the environment for good or worse, but it also has an environmental impact, like it produces emissions, waste, etc. And I thought that kind of spoke to our predicament here that we're dealing with today as researchers, that we produce knowledge about the environment. We might be teaching on sustainability or climate action or environmental justice, or trying to figure out what's happening to the planet, what's happening to the physical world across disciplines. But we are also contributing to the problem as well, through technology, through our emissions, through the way we work. Like, some research processes can be incredibly wasteful. And I thought, you know, you evoked Dipesh Chakravarti, and he talks about how the technology that I think was it measured that the glaciers were melting and kind of discovered some of the impacts of climate change was the same technology that was used to drill oil. So it kind of spoke to that paradox that our methods of learning and knowledge that are helping us to address the climate crisis are at the very same time we can be so aware of how they're actually contributing to the problem as well. And I think as researchers, a lot of us might kind of deal with that paradox as well. I feel like that's a lot of what we're doing today. So yeah, that was a response to your presentation. If you're welcome to respond if you want to.
I mean, I think we all struggle with that, but I was actually I enjoyed the points Nessa was making about this particularly, and that model from Maastricht, I think, is really good in giving people a kind of sense of the context in which you make the decision. So, you know, I've often had arguments with people who say you should get a train, get the ferry to England, get the train to London, get the Eurostar, and, you know, spend 2 days traveling to events in the Czech Republic. And I have to kind of say, but if I do that, I have children who need to be cared for by my spouse who's got a career abroad, and, you know, all these other consequences have to be taken into account. And so, you know, one kind of sense of environmental justice can then run into lots of other things as well we have to think about. But when you just say, is it 8 hours away?
Yeah.
You know, that's a really simple benchmark. And I do think we have to give people permission to make their own choices, but those kind of really clear guidelines are so helpful.
Absolutely, yes. But those abstract questions, make them a bit more concrete by contextualizing them, where you might say, oh, I'm contributing so much damage. Well, what is it then? And maybe it's not as large as you actually think. Yeah. Okay.
thanks. I noticed that at least two of you mentioned you were in the Irish Academy of the Royal Irish Academy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Or officially that we're going on.
No, I'm just wondering how important is that as a researcher? It's just, I suppose the reason why I'm asking is there's just a few weeks ago, the head of BP globally was inducted into the Irish Academy for Engineering in September. He was the same guy who was, John Gibbons tweeted about it during the week that the same guy was in the part of the COP that he shouldn't have been as head of BP. He was representing some other country. He's actually from Kerry, which is the reason why he's in the Irish Academy of Engineering. So I'm just wondering, I actually don't know anything about these organizations much at all. I'm only a recent academic. I haven't been in academia for a long time. I'm just wondering, and my reflections on working in sustainability for a long time, and that climate solutions technologically, because I'm an engineer background, that all the solutions are there. But it's the power structures and decisions and the politics that is usually, like even in the university today, we were highlighting that it's, you know, the power structures as well that can be a barrier. Just wondering from the Irish Royal Academy, does that have much power or influence over our research, and whether the changes that you're looking for will be supported by them anyhow? Does that trickle down? I have no idea actually, so I was just wondering myself, sorry.
Yeah, a few different responses, I suppose. I mean, in relation specifically to the Royal Irish Academy, as somebody mentioned, you know, they're doing things like open science, scoping studies that are trying to address this. But I do think there's, and again, you know, Nessa made this point, like we have to embed sustainability and environmental consciousness in everything we do. And so the Royal Irish Academy has a role to play, Irish Research Council, Science Foundation Ireland, they all, you know, so a unifying strategy that would define how all of those organizations do their work, but also how they solicit applications for funding, I think would be really helpful. In relation to the other, I didn't know about the thing about the president of BP being inducted into the Irish Academy.
I was just looking there, the two different things actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Just to Google there, the two different
Yeah, I mean, I see it in arts funding all the time, where, you know, the arts sector in Ireland is very climate conscious, but we still have a Bord Gáis Energy Theatre smack in the middle of Dublin, and, you know, festivals like the Galway Arts Festival take sponsorship from Flowgas, because Flowgas is a clean energy company, but it's owned by a fossil fuel company, and so that gives rise to questions about whether that's greenwashing or not. And, you know, I think everybody has to think about this carefully. There's an argument that by not engaging with the fossil fuel companies, especially if in good faith they're actually moving to transition out of polluting energy, then, you know, either you have a decision to make there about whether you engage with them or not. And I think that's complicated. But again, I think that kind of nuanced evidence-based decision-making process that people have talked about is probably the right way forward.
Just to add on to that as well, I think the value of those kinds of organisations and the Irish Humanities Alliance as well, that have co-sponsored this event today, is that it provides people an opportunity, it opens a space for people from different areas, kind of from a discipline, but also different institutions across the island of Ireland in particular. And this is a really important point. It's not just North and South, it's all of us together. And we don't really have many opportunities for that. So it's something we can learn from each other and then bring it back into our own institutional spaces, and then help and support researchers like Ashley and Laois developing their own projects for the next phase of what needs to be done as well. So they serve a really important function that way, but it also ties into we learn what's happening globally as well through other networks and associations. So like the ALEA project is a European-wide report, and that's disseminated across all of Europe now as well. So, so there's value in that. I know that the Royal Irish Academy as well is also looking at how to do sustainable events. So one example there, you know, you get these conference bags often, they're often, you know, maybe not very environmentally sustainable, but they were looking to source it from jute that's made in Donegal, and then they wanted particular inks and dyes with it, and even looking at pop-ups and things or wherever they are around the place, and how they can be done in a more sustainable way as well. So the Academy is looking at things like that, which is great.
I have a question for Nessa on this. Anybody else does have a question? I don't want to be all in.
Perfect. Yeah, Nessa, really interested in your thinking on incorporating humanities perspectives into sustainable development. And I was wondering, is there anything to be said or thinking about maybe humanities work as being lower carbon or not as energy intensive as work in other disciplines? I don't know, is that a useful thing to think about, and have you any thoughts on that, or does that come up in any of the thinking that you've done around it or the reading?
Yeah, I actually made a note of that when I saw the energy consumption of what labs were on campus, and I was like, oh God, we're doing very well, you know, I just get a book from the library or whatever, and I don't print as much as I used to, except I have to print a thesis every now and then to read. I'm not quite sure if that's very helpful, because then it becomes a little bit of an audit, and then it might be kind of a name and shame kind of thing. And again, I think we should be looking at wider structural changes to support initiatives and to help develop it in a more positive way. So I'd be less, I wouldn't want to do kind of a housekeeping about who's doing what and how many points you have for this or that and the other, but I'd be more looking for structural change and support for that. So a sustainability team, a sustainability office, a vice president for sustainability, and developing all of these in different ways across the university campuses. Like Galway, there aren't that many sustainability officers in universities in Ireland at all. Like not all HEIs have a sustainability officer, and very few have one full time, and it's usually one person. So so that there's more work to be done there. So I'd be looking more structural change rather than doing a kind of a granular thing about that. But it is a very interesting point.
Thanks, Nessa. Anybody else want to ask a question or a comment? Okay. We have a few more minutes. Actually, I'm going to give a question
To Siobhan, sorry, I'm completely hogging. But Siobhan, thanks so much for the presentation. It was fantastic to see all the work that the Green Labs is doing. Like, it does seem absolutely fantastic. And I guess I was kind of wondering, in terms of like, because you seem to be doing some of that work yourself, and you know other people who are doing that work. Are there any kind of like team building or emotional benefits to doing the Green Labs work that you do, as well as the kind of environmental impact that you're having? Like, does it kind of, I don't know, is there kind of like a feel-good factor involved? And is there, if you could
very
even speak to
satisfying. I suppose our team are mostly postdoctoral scientists. So we have one PhD student, so we have a large team, but they were all very eco-conscious anyway when they came onto into the team, when we all came together. And then when I raised the prospect of carrying out like a Migraine Lab certification, they were all, most people were on board. One or two people maybe needed a little bit more encouragement, but but the sense of achievement then when we did get our certification was good. But it's more satisfying the day-to-day that, because when you are doing biological research, everything is single-use plastics, everything is waste. But to separate it out and to actually, save whatever it was, 5 kilograms of plastic going into hazardous waste, and that costs extra money. So it's also a money-saving exercise as well, because by doing the Green Lab process, we save money from the budget. So as someone else said, the budget is a moral document or whatever, so we're morally saving some cash from the public, maybe. No, it's good.
Thanks. No, I think it always is worth thinking about the kind of broad, multiple social and ecological benefits of doing that kind of climate action. Yeah, Patrick?
Just as a follow-on for that, so when you're working with PhDs and postdocs, you said many were enthusiastic, but some were reticent. Just curious to know, like in terms of lines on their CV, I assume it's good for them to have that on their CV, but was there any concern that if I do my research in this way that it might affect my career prospects, or what was it?
No, nobody ever thought of that.
I'm just wondering, like, where was the reticence coming from?
No, well, it's change, a behavioural change,
So it's just something new.
Change. Change. Nobody.
Which is where the culture bit comes in, actually.
It's just what you're used to doing, and then to change it. But when you see it's a better way of doing it, then everybody.
Really interesting.
Thanks so much. So we'll wrap up the panel there. Thank you again so much to our speakers. We really appreciate it. That was brilliant. Thank you. So we're kind of coming into the very last section of the day. We've got about 15 minutes until lunchtime. So we have invited Professor Marie-Louise Coulihan from English here in University of Galway to say a few closing words, and we're delighted to have her. So Marie-Louise will say just a few words for maybe 5-10 minutes, and then Laois is going to come in and officially close the workshop. And I do want to say thank you so much all for your contributions and your participation. It's been brilliant, and we greatly appreciate it. So I'm just going to introduce Marie-Louise, and then we'll invite her up. So yeah, Professor Marie-Louise Coulihan is the head of English here at University of Galway, and she is the vice chair of the Irish Humanities Alliance, who are one of the hosts for this workshop. And you've kindly agreed to come and say some closing words. So I'll invite you up, Marie-Louise. Thanks a million. Thanks. Yeah, if you don't mind, thanks.
Okay, thanks a million for the invitation to speak, and thanks a million for running the workshop. I might start off with the question asked at the end there about these organisations. Who are they and what do they do? So, I mean, although I'm the head of English here, the reason I've been invited to speak is because I'm currently vice chair of the Irish Humanities Alliance, which is an umbrella body, really. As Nessa mentioned, it's an all-island body, trying to give voice to the humanities in the broadest sense. So music, visual art, as well as the humanities as practiced in this university. And essentially it's kind of an umbrella group that many institutions pay to be part of. It has a very slim, streamlined organisation. There's only one person who works full-time for it, the director, Mel Farrell. And so positions like the one that I have, vice chair, that just every year changes, it rotates and it's done for free. So it's no great august position from which I'm speaking. But it does offer us that kind of, to come back to the question about power, it seems to me, and it's very clearly coming out, I think, from the discussions today, that the only way we make progress in these kinds of issues is to work on the embeddedness and the interactiveness, and to try and get these bodies talking to each other and collectively trying to move towards change. So a body like the IHA on its own really can't on its own affect change, but it does have a voice that represents the whole island, and has, you know, board meetings. Every institution has a couple of members. Nessa is one for Galway at the moment, and I'm one for Galway. We meet twice a year to progress agendas. It's a shoestring budget, but there can be events like this that we can support, and that maybe gives visibility to the event, but also within the body itself, it means events like this are visible, and colleagues who are working across the island can get a sense of what's going on and plug in with each other. And I think, coming in from I wasn't able to attend the workshops this morning, but it seems that one of the items of discussion was, how do we make this stuff easier? I think one of the answers to that is by having this kind of interactiveness within the institution of Galway. I know there's been some discussions of how to do that, but also on a wider sense of having it on the agenda for bodies like the Irish Humanities Alliance, because as a kind of lobby group or an umbrella advocacy group, it does get to meet with policymakers. And so it's not like its voice is a particularly powerful one, but it is a voice, and it does have access to policymakers. And that's maybe how we get these kinds of changes in place. And I suppose on a minor level, as Ashley has said, and as Ness has already mentioned, the blog spot for the IHA is often a kind of very informal but effective way of getting these messages across too. So I suppose really from the perspective of the IHA, that's part, I think that the organisation would see this as a mutual kind of endeavour that needs to be ongoing. I think I'd really like to congratulate Ashley and Laoise for what they've done. It seems to me a very pioneering endeavour, and not least in trying to get the science part of the house talking to the culture, the arts and humanities parts of the house, because this is really an area in which we all have everything vested in together, and finding ways of creating alliances so that we can change things within the institution or across the island within our institutions collectively, and sharing best practice methods, I think, is a real way forward. I particularly liked the narrative arc of the panel that preceded me, with Patrick's talking about maybe forcing us to think in ways that we're not used to about the complicity of the arts and humanities in the fossil economy and fossil capitalism. But then the arc moving towards inspiring models like Migraine Labs of how we can really do things or be enabled to do things that improve what we're doing. And then Nessa's really informative set of slides, I'll certainly be asking for them afterwards, with links to, because one of the other themes I think in the couple of hours I've been here that's come through is the challenge of communications. that there's lots and lots of activity happening, but how do we find ways of pulling that together? And an event like today is a really wonderful way of pulling that together, of sharing ideas, of letting people know where the best practice policies and documents are. And I suppose in next steps, it's partly about finding ways of embedding those in structures, as you said, kind of, you know, across the university, making sure that it's not all dumped in a silo of the sustainability office. And maybe the IHA and its website can be a portal of sorts for some of this kind of thing as well. And you know, the crucial challenge is, as someone mentioned this morning, that we're all getting emails all the time, and we therefore miss stuff all the time. And I think that's a challenge that all institutions have all the time now. How do you cut through? And one of the advantages maybe that I feel like this has is that it's ever more clear to people how crucial it is to the way they live their daily lives. And therefore there is a cut through advantage that normal policy documents maybe don't have. And we need to maybe think about ways, and I know you're going to have a follow-on workshop that might also keep this conversation going with the IHA, and think about ways that we can cut through together and try and work with that. I mean, the key areas that seem to jump out at me in terms of the discussion are those questions of information and communications, equity, and equity in terms not only of geography, but in terms of career development, early career, later career, mid-career people. These are all ways that we need to think about, I think, embedding these kinds of agendas. The question that we started out with, I think, in the pulling together session, I think Deirdre might be gone now, about how do we expand the base? And I wonder maybe that might be a way to leave off my comments, is to see a pioneering event like this as a springboard. And that the next question then is, well, how do we really expand that base? And I think the question this morning was in terms of internally in Galway, how do we expand the base? And the idea of a survey is really useful in doing that. And just the value of getting people together. I mean, those trade-offs in terms of transport and carbon offsets, that's one of the big challenges that I think we've all realised. The hybrid or even online only workshops and events work really well, but actually the forging of durable connections and alliances really does need people to meet in person. So anyway, I think I would like to see this. It is certainly pioneering from the IHA perspective. I think we would want to support it and its next steps in any way we can. And I suppose I would urge us all to think about what those next steps might be, having got these people into a room and a virtual room together, trying to get more people together and think about ways that we might kind of work on this as a springboard, so that we really can try and embed best decarbonising practices in all of our research methods. And awareness is the first step towards that. And I think you've both done a brilliant job of moving us forward in those kinds of ways. So the thanks of the Irish Humanities Alliance to you guys and to everybody who's been participating.
One more talk and then we're all free then, right? So, first things first, the food has arrived, okay, in Vian Shaw. It's all vegetarian. There's some vegan options. We're going to have a lot of surplus, and we actually brought lunch boxes back there. So if you want to take some back to your labs or wherever you're going, please do take them, because we're going to have a lot.
Yeah, and keep the lunch boxes.
Keep the lunch boxes, yeah. So I just have a few words here, and I'm going to keep it as brief as I can. So a charge bhaitlin mishe agus Ashley buchas a live fad as a bheith in Shaw and you. Myself and Ashley would like to sincerely thank you all for being here today and for participating in such an open, engaging and invigorating manner. We've heard, it's safe to say, from our invited speakers, online participants and in-person attendees that these issues around decarbonising research are issues that people deeply care about. We've spent the day thinking about them, sharing them, debating them, and trying to come to grips overall with what is, no doubt, an enormous challenge ahead: decarbonisation. Decarbonisation not only of our research methods, but of our university buildings, our labs, our libraries, our offices, our modes of transport, our infrastructure, our culture, and our society as a whole. The challenge might seem insurmountable, and I think we all suffer sometimes from a sense of impending doom, understandably enough. Opening the papers, checking the news, and glancing at social media only serve to undergird our justified fears about the future, and as well highlighting our frustration about our fears and about expressing those fears. All too often, I think we feel like individuals screaming into the void, all too aware of climate change, biodiversity crises, the erosion of minority languages and cultures, as our current fossil fuel powered systems grind inexorably onwards, ignoring in many cases what is apparent to all, I say in an unseasonably warm November month. Despair seems logical for climate, for biodiversity, for minority languages and cultures. However, my voice is going to go up now because it's happy. This workshop is a moment of hope and exchange. It has shown us that people do care. People are thinking about these crucially important issues and are willing to show up, even on a Friday, sit down and talk about them with frankness and honesty, admitting challenges on the way and considering what might be done differently, what we can do collectively, what we can change, what we can improve, alter, consider, make more sustainable, make more collaborative, and that is something to be celebrated. Ashley and I sincerely hope that this is only the beginning of this conversation and collaboration within the university and beyond it. Incidentally, we are actually having a follow-up online workshop next Friday, the 25th of November, with a different panel of speakers, so the conversation is going to continue, but I would invite anyone here who wants to organise your own thing. We don't own the concept of decarbonising research, so just run with it. But we do hope that the ideas discussed today will percolate, be distilled, and will be useful to you and your wider networks. We do plan to have outputs from this workshop, suggestions to university management, blog posts, talking points, and tangible things that have all arisen from this conversation today. I also want to note that we did invite the president. He actually did send his apologies that he couldn't come. So I just want to put that in the record too, that he is aware that this is happening. We would like to thank our sponsors and our hosts, the Moore Institute, Martha, Dan, and Ivona. There's a lot of things in this university that would not happen without them, for all their help, the Insight Centre for Data Analytics, and the Irish Humanities Alliance, particularly Mel, Maxine, and Mary-Louise. Thank you to all our speakers, Vincent, Nessa, Siobhan, Patrick, and Mary-Louise, for their ideas and insight, which added so much to our conversation today. Thank you to Cormac, who's been amazing in dealing with the technical side of things. Thank you to Maya and Master Chefs for providing our food and refreshments. Thank you to Una for bringing the biscuits when no one else would. And I want to say a special thank you to Ashley for being a fantastic co-organizer and friend, who submitted her PhD last week while organising this workshop. And I just want to give her a round of applause for that. Truly a heroic feat, we might say. Thank you to all of you in person and online for speaking up, sharing your ideas, collaborating, and for coming along to join us in this workshop on decarbonising research. We do have the room for a while, so please feel free to chat and mingle while you enjoy the lunch. Take a lunchbox, grab a load of sandwiches, and enjoy. And go mille mahigi ar fad as a bhain seán you. Thanks so much.